Okay, hello everyone. I hope this presentation finds you well. I'm here in my house. I hope you guys are in your houses too. I give a little of Georgia Tech background so we can have that environment of knowledge and learning, even though we're still in our houses. And I will definitely would like to start my presentation sharing a little bit of what a trip has been this course for me. At the beginning, I wasn't expecting to learn so much related to my actual research. I approached the course more of information that I was interested in, but that didn't have that much relationship with my core research, that is science museums and the history of science museums. And I've been amazed because definitely I didn't know that there was regulation regarding museums and library. And through all the reports that we have to sign up for Dr. Bark, I've been able to raise so many questions, and that definitely has helped my previous research and has give a different approach to my thesis. So I definitely will encourage you guys, especially the ones that are in undergrad studies, sometimes to approach courses that don't seem to be that related to your field, and that giving a lot of information and definitely a different approach that it will be a benefit for you. So during all these reports, I've done nothing more than raise a lot of questions, and I wanted to show this to in my presentation. I do not have the answers. I think nobody has, but it definitely helped us ourselves to raise some questions of how we, our citizens, approach museums and library, what's our role, and what can we demand too, because it's not only a place that we just go to be entertained or to spend time. We also have some rights regarding to them, and we should also advocate for them in a sense. Um, Definitely the first question I raised in report number 1 was who regulates museums and libraries. I was not expected to find independent agencies. I thought this was part of the of the Department of Education, the way it's in other countries. So I was very surprised to see that, in fact, there were independent agencies. So the main one, and the one that I'm going to be talking about, is the Institute of Museums and Libraries. But there are other independent agencies that have some relation regarding to museums and libraries. The first one is the National Endowment for Arts and Humanities. And another one that is like a semi-independent agency is the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts. I personally don't understand why it has to be a separate institution. And the fourth one is a very controversial institution regarding to the topic of regulation, that is the Smithsonian Institution, because it's very well known, but at the same time, it works as not as a public, but at the same time, not as a private institution. So it's kind of in between. It benefits from both status. And this has raised many questions from many scholars and professionals in the fields of museums. So I think it's a very interesting institution to study, and it raises a lot of questions. I won't be going deeper into this. I just wanted to make sure that the Smithsonian's work in a different field, and definitely that pays them well at the same time. So as I said before, I'm going to mainly be focusing on the Institute of Museums and Library Services. At the beginning of this, I didn't know that there was an institution that regulates this. And we can see that the type of regulation they do must be very different from other type of agencies. When we're talking about museums and libraries, we are talking about a very, very broad of institutions. Definitely standardization is not one of their goals, as it could be with other type of regulation when we think about the FDA or other agencies. Museums and libraries, every museum, every library is different. We can see that the ones that are in the cities, sometimes they serve more tourism instead of the local population, or they can be very big, like I don't know, the Congress Library, or they can be very small, such as a local library. And definitely this is a challenge for an agency to be regulating such a diverse rate of institutions. And we also have to acknowledge that even though we think about museums and library as a luxury or something that we do in our free time, this is mainly the situations in cities or in affluent communities. Both museums and libraries serve a range of necessities, And especially for rural and tribal communities, libraries are one of the few resources that are in these communities where there's no access to internet or access to books or support to schools. So museums, so especially libraries, they have a very close relation with their communities because they serve a lot of the services that are supposed to be given by the government. So they kind of fill this gap. And we can see this in many cases. For example, now that is the census, many of the distribution channels is through libraries. Sometimes libraries or small museums are the only government figure for some communities. So we have to, I wanted to make sure we're having this into account at the beginning of the presentation and not just at the end, because that speaks for the reality of most of these type of institutions. So like a very institutional, the mission of this institute is to advance, support, and empower America's museums and libraries and organizations. This is a very intangible objective. And the way they do it, which is like what they really do, is they offer grant making, research, and policy development. When they talk about research, they mean the institute themselves conveys a lot of research regarding the role of libraries and museums. And this is very helpful because they serve as the institution that holds together all the data that we can gather from museums and libraries, because there are so many museums and libraries that it's very hard to centralize all the information. And when they talk about policy development, they talk about different acts that the institute have passed in the past years. I have to say, like, by reading all the acts, there's not much difference. There's been some adding. For example, they included that they have all museums and library has to have tribal acknowledge of tribal communities or minorities, etc. So the changes have not been very drastic. Just to give a sense of when did this started, it started in 1996, which was the Clinton administration. And this is very interesting because museums and library has been part of the United States for centuries, from the 18th century, 19th century. They were a core institution regarding to what is known as nation building. And they're definitely a big part of the lives of many citizens of this country. So for this institution that holds them together to start in 1996, that's a very new agency comparing to other agencies. And then some of the major points in the lifetime of this agency has been in 2002 with the e-government act that pushed for the putting a lot of resources online. And then 2003, that was with the Bush administration, it was they started the museum with the pass of this act. They started the plans for the Museum of African Americans, and also in 2010 they had to pass the new act. This was with Obama, because every 7 years, as we can see from 2003 to 2010, they have to renew the act that regulates this agency. And lately, the last act has been in a couple of years ago during the Trump administration. So we can see how every 7 years, the Institute has to renew the act, which is, from my perspective, a little, gives the opportunity to make it very unstable, and opens the door for politicians that are always wanted to close this agency. So I think, like, because museums and library are institutions that they don't work for 1 year or two, they are like long-standing institutions. So having to every 7 years being to reorganize or do this major effort is definitely a challenge for them. And I think it takes a lot of their resources. So regarding to like the institutional goals of the institute, I wanted to kind of translate what they do, because their goals, the way they're presented, is very fairy tale for me, at least. I was expecting more, comparing to other agencies that we've been studying. I was expecting more direct missions. So for example, one of their mission is to promote lifelong learning. And what does that mean? And what they really want to say is to promote learning and literacy among the citizens of the United States. When they say they want to build capacity for museums and library, they're actually saying they want to give grants or give their resources to strengthen the staff training, because the staff training is very, very important to the development of especially a library, because are the ones that have to be updated in resources and are the ones that are more in contact with the community. When they say they want to increase public access, they really are, what they're really saying is they want to increase public access to information, that's books, magazines, newspaper, databases, etc. Ideas, when they, especially libraries and museums, incorporate other cultures, incorporate artists, do workshops, etc., and networks. They also want to be a place where artists can network, where people that doesn't have a job can apply to a job. That's one of the very important services that libraries do that most people don't acknowledge. People think libraries are just to get books. And when we see libraries do a great job supporting the population that is looking for a new job. And at the end, they also said one of their goals is to achieve excellence. And what they really mean is they want to align resources and relationships. They want to kind of level all the museums. So, but that's very far from reality. The reality is some museums and some libraries have a lot of funds, whether private or from their communities, whether other libraries and museums are less funded. So they want to kind of level that up and use the resources in the better way. So what we talk about the regulations of museums and libraries, of this agency, we're talking about the grants that they offer. That's one of their main activities. And they offer grants, small grants, they are not a lot, to museums and libraries. As we can see, their budget for grants is not that big, actually. Well, they have increased a little bit in this year. So I don't have the number now, but there are millions of museums and libraries in the United States. So it's definitely doesn't serve the whole community. And this is where I was very interested in, because we can see that although the Institute does not regulate that daily activity of museums and library, it's not that they say you cannot do this intervention or you cannot do this program. They don't have that capacity to kind of like be the dog watch of all the institutions. But yes, through the grants, they can influence what type of programs are being done by museums and libraries. And this is very important because this can be related to the current administration. So even though the museum cannot regulate the information itself, it can regulate it indirectly through which type of grants they support and which type of grants they don't support. And they can also, through this system of grant making, they can support some type of museums and they can not support some other type of museums. So I think a deeper research for me will be to search for what type of grants they've been doing and they've been giving and what type of grants they've been rejecting. So this is maybe more an abstract conclusion, but that's what mainly I'm more interested in, because we can see that the museums have very intangible missions when they talk about improving information, I don't know, making better citizens. That's a little fairy tale and that's very intangible. And they have to translate this to the tangible world that is money and numbers. So they can get access to funding, they can get access to these grants. And actually the museum works in the government, which is very tangible. When we search for the reports of this agency, another agency, a lot of things are translated into numbers, into money. And at the same time, the outcomes that are expected for museums and library are very intangible as well. You're expecting that citizens go to a museum and end up being like a better citizens, or have more culture or have more information. So I think this, especially for this agency, it's very particular to being, for them to being able to move across that intangible, tangible, intangible scenarios. They have to translate their language, they have to translate their resources, and in a very different ways. Like, for example, when me as a personal citizen, when I go to a museum, of course, when I arrive, I'm not looking for a tangible outcome. I'm not looking that I'm going to be making money when I leave, or I'm going to be learning, I don't know, 10 new words. I definitely approach the museum with more like an inspirational desire. I put the money, which is something tangible, but I don't expect to double the money or something. I just expect to be inspired. So just like going for a deeper research and a deeper analysis, this is the real challenge, at least from my perspective, for an agency as this one to survive in a very tangible and standardized uh, government and society. So as we can see, this has put them in a very critical situation, because in this year's budget, the Trump administration has been proposed to eliminate the institute as a whole, because they see that, of course, it's very hard for the institute to I don't know, translate the benefits of having it into tangible benefits. And this is not a new, this is from this year, as we can see, this for next year budget. But this also happened in last year, and it also happened in the previous year, and it also happened in the previous year. So for the past 4 years that we've been on the Trump administration, there have been multiple attempts to close this agency as a whole. And one of the arguments that is being made, not only by the administration, but also by some congressmen, is that museums and libraries get more of their funding from their local state governments and from funding from private enterprises and or just charity, and public funding is not necessary. However, they are, by saying this, they are not acknowledging that even if that's true, even if most of the incomes of museums and library are from other sources that are not federal sources, this means that they are not acknowledging that they need an institution that at least at minimum gathers all the data and put it in a report, which serves for all the other libraries and museums to have some type of guidance, which is personally what I think the most valuable thing from the Institute, because the fact that the museums and library have to apply to grants make them do the effort to put all their intangible value into tangible information, into numbers, into data, which is definitely not the primary interest for most of these institutions. So to having an agency that raises the bar or tries to put everyone in the same level is a benefit for museums and library as a whole. So just to make sure that this is not something that happens every year, this is from the previous year, from 2018, when they actually are asking for money for this agency. This was during the Obama administration. And just like a quick random fact, this is so obvious and has been going on so many times in the past years that the actual webpage of the Institute has frequent asked questions regarding the president budget request. And they actually, the first one is it closed? And it's no, because this debate is so like hidden and now that they need to answer this simple question that, hey, we're still working. And they actually make it very clear that they cannot advocate for themselves. Then that's where the museums and library has a strong benefit, because overall museums and library have strong connections with their communities, and they've been able to organize and call their communities to kind of raise their voice and contact the representative to kind of change the situation. So again, like we see this scenario is like the real challenge that we're talking about, that is how to regulate something that is intangible. How can I regulate the access to culture, or how can I regulate having a better informed citizenship? And also, as we see, the main regulation that this agency does is not in the intangible, it's not in the contents, it's more in the way that museums are organizing, what type of programs are they doing. And as a whole, I definitely think it end up helping a lot the community that museums are and libraries are held responsible to some type of agency, because as we see, the agency primary objective is not to apply censorship, but actually to level up the way that resources and libraries are working. That's from my perspective. At the same time, we as society need to think about how museums are approaching to us and how can we improve that. And as I said before, it's very important in order to be to museums to understand that they are working in a numbers world, as we can say, and they've been doing it actually, because when you go into deeper of the reports of the institute, we see a lot of this type of data as 55 million students group have visited museums, 50 billion has been put into US economy. So now we're talking money, and museums and library actually put a lot of money into the economy, in their local economy and the economy overall. The numbers of jobs, the numbers of tax revenue, the hours of volunteers, that's very good, because actually they save a lot of money by reaching their community. Also, like the number of Americans that visit public libraries. And actually last year, regarding to some research, libraries were the most visited place for Americans, outstanding movies and sports events. And we're also talking about that 171 million people in America have library cards. This is almost like the double of people that have an actual ID. This is kind of half of how many people have a driving license. So it's not like every American has a library card, but this tells us a lot. And I think the museums have to work. When we go to a museum and we work to a library, maybe we are not thinking in numbers, but I think it's very important for museums and library to be thinking in numbers in order to be showing themselves as being able to show how their risk and benefits can be translated into numbers, even though it's very hard, because one, access to a library or a museum can change the life of a person, but that's very hard to put into numbers. And just to finish, I think it's very important for museums, libraries, and communities to support this type of regulations. As we have seen, as I've mentioned, there's not cases of museums and library directly regulating the content of museums and library. They are not applying censorship, which is very good, because then if the agency becomes a way of the government to control what type of information citizens are getting access to, then it will be something that we will have to think about. To this point, that's not the case. Of course, there is some of indirect control in the way to who is getting the grants, who are not getting the grants, but it is not to the level of the information. It's not a level of censorship. And at the same time, we have to think that museums and library fill a gap of services that are not being presented, or that are not being filled by the government, for example, which is access to information, access to books, etc., etc., etc. So definitely that is not a place for the private and local communities to fund it. So of course, every type of source of funding, it's very helpful. And actually museums and library need more funding. And as a surprise, we've seen in the CARE Act that has been passed in the past few weeks as a response to the coronavirus, there's been $50 million that has been added to the agency budget. So we are seeing how even in this pandemic, when museums and library were one of the first institutions to close, they've become very essential, because they've been supporting a lot of their communities, they've been supporting a lot of students, and they've been supporting a lot of people that we have been inside our homes. So I hope this scenario where they have become more essential also will help them for a future, so they can have more support from the government. And finally, there's some references, and if you pay attention to them, most of them are from newspapers or opinions. So there's not much scholar-based articles about it. So that's definitely something to think about. The way our scholars are approaching museums and library is not typically through regulation, and the type of information that is online is based as answers to whatever the government is making or responses. So that's definitely a place for improvement for academia. So thank you very much. Please, if you have any questions, just let me know in the comments and I will happily to answer. And I hope this changes the way you can visit to a museum and a library in the future when everything is reopened. So be safe and thank you for listening.